Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Still see a few people filtering in, so I'll give them a moment to sit down before I start. So, hi. I'm Dirk Tiede, and today I am so excited to be here. I came to the Blender conference last year for the first time, and I met so many wonderful people. This community is so amazing. And I was showing people what I was doing, and they were giving me such wonderful feedback. They said, "Hey, are you doing a talk?" And I said, "No, I didn't even think to submit." And so this year I submitted, and here I am. So today I want to show you the journey I've gone on for the past 3.5 years to bring my comics to life in animated form. So I've worked as a comic book creator and illustrator for over 25 years. And I started my comic, Paradigm Shift, way back in 1998, in the early days of the internet, back when comics were still drawn on paper, anime still came on VHS. Video on the web was a joke, and 3D animation was very primitive unless you were lucky enough to work at Pixar or Industrial Light and Magic. So Paradigm Shift is a werewolf detective story. It follows the journey of a young Chicago cop who gets assigned to this strange back alley murder case, and then she starts developing symptoms. It's kind of a classic police procedural meets the supernatural. And it was one of the very first webcomics. I started posting it online in 1999 and went on to become a part of the early webcomics scene. And over the years, I've published 6 books, drawn hundreds and hundreds of pages of comics. But from the very, very beginning, I always wanted to see it animated. The characters move around in my head. They talk. They move around as if they were in a film or a TV show. And the comics was sort of the best medium that I could do by myself to bring these stories to life. And it worked. In the late 90s and early 2000s, self-publishing became very, very accessible. And it's the sort of thing that starting by publishing on the web and moving to print was sort of very within reach because of the desktop publishing software. And so over the years, I attended San Diego Comic-Con for like over a decade, attending and exhibiting, all, in the back of my mind, kind of hoping that maybe somebody in Hollywood would see what I was doing and, maybe animate it. I always hoped for that. But aside from one call with an agent that never went anywhere, that dream didn't come true. But I just kept drawing the comic. But I kept imagining what would it be like to animate especially these werewolf transformation sequences, which I had so much fun drawing. I spent a long time designing, and I could just imagine, doing in 3D because, you could just take a mesh and stretch and squash and push it. But I didn't think any of that was something I could do myself. Until early 2022, I was working on a manuscript for the next storyline for the series, and developing a proposal for a publisher, and I got the most worst case of writer's block that I had experienced in my career. I was just banging my head over and over again, trying to rewrite a plot line, trying to figure out all these elements that weren't working, and I was kind of left in a quandary. What am I going to do? And after a couple weeks, almost a month of not getting anywhere, I decided to just set the project down for a little while, because usually that's what happens when I face a creative block. I change gears and try something else. At first, all I did was play video games for a couple of weeks. But one of them was a building game, and I realized I was kind of playing with Legos like I did when I was a kid. And it occurred to me that I could play with Legos and learn Blender. I had done 3D animation back in college in the mid-90s, but again, it was very primitive. But my senior thesis was a 1.5-minute long animated like Star Trek spaceships fighting each other sort of thing, and I had a lot of fun with it, but once I tried doing character animation after that, it just all fell apart because the tools just weren't there. So I'd always wanted to know, how do you do character animation? And so I looked up some tutorials online, including Blender Studio's Making of Rain, and it looked really complicated. I went, oh, I don't think I have the skills to do that. However, I had been playing with some other software called Daz Studio that had all these free, fully rigged human models. And I'd played with Poser back, in the early aughts, and it was the same sort of deal. And I realized you could export the meshes out into Blender, and you could modify them and bring them back in as morphs. So I decided to take this base Genesis 8 female model and see if I could turn her into a werewolf. I wasn't trying to make my own character per se, I was just trying to see if it worked. And so I started out by just making a basic feral morph, pointing some ears, pointing some teeth, pointing some fingernails, but it worked. I had a little slider that would go back and forth. And I was like, ooh, well, let's see how far we can push this. So I pulled out the designs of the werewolf and came up with some more extreme morphs. And after about 4 weeks, including having to come up with textures and figure out how to model hair, I was able to create this. So this was rendered in Daz, but it's a proof of concept. The prototype worked. I was like, wow, well, how far can I go with this? However, this doesn't look anything like my comic. It looks kind of like a bad video game. But I wondered, okay, at that point I'd been playing with Blender enough to realize, oh, you can do cell shading. Oh, you could do outlines. Maybe I could make this look more like my comic. So I brought the model back into Blender and started modifying it. And after a couple more weeks, I had this. I had to model fur, figure out shape keys. This ended up being 3 different rigs that sort of meshed together between frames to pull it off. But I had dreamed about doing this for 20 years, and suddenly I had it. And I was incredibly excited. I had this working, transformable, fully animatable figure. And I decided I should do something with this. So, I've got a prototype transformation. I might as well put it into a story, see if I can do a quick sequence from the comic in Blender. Let's see if I can do it. So I decided to take one of the transformation sequences from the comic, and I modeled a basic bedroom set. I played around with some lighting. It took about a month to kind of figure out how to do it, but then I ended up animating this. And thank you. So as you can imagine, I had a lot of fun making that. And during that process, I had to figure out how to do particle systems for hair and simulations for creating the blinds and all sorts of things that I wouldn't have never have realized I needed to make, but I did. And it was just so much fun. And I finished this quick sequence and realized I want to make more. So I just kept going. And I spent the next year creating my first short film, Restless Sleep, which sort of retells sort of the core part of the paradigm shift story. Detective Kate McAllister investigating strange mauling, but then she has a weird dream where she turns into a werewolf, and maybe she killed the guy, maybe she didn't. She wakes up at the end, not sure, but it's very, very much within the theme of the comic. But before I even, and so I spent 6 months putting it all together, and then another 6 months cleaning it all up. And so in June of 2023, I debuted Restless Sleep on YouTube, and had a great reception from my audience, and a bunch of new people who had never seen the comic before discovered it through YouTube. But before I even posted the film, I posted the trailer, and I got contacted by a company called Storia that was creating an app that adapted short stories to animated form. And so it was sort of like an illustrated short story, but then it would be frequently intercut with pieces of animation. So I adapted 2 horror stories for them over the next year and used these projects to refine my ability to create characters, again, using the Genesis 8 platform as my base, and refining my pipeline, increasing the efficiency of how I was animating things. And at the end of that year, I knew that I wanted to do another paradigm shift story. However, this time I wanted to bring all the new skills that I had, and I wanted a voice cast. And I knew it would be a much bigger production. It would take more time. So I ended up running a Kickstarter to give me some help so I could pay a voice cast and a sound designer and a voice director and a couple of assistants who could help me with compositing and rigging and some other things that while I'm doing almost all the Blender stuff myself, I was able to pass off a little bit of the work and pay them for their time. So I decided I would adapt a 20-page sequence from the comic into a short. And I chose a pivotal moment from this first story where Kate's werewolf powers first manifest after she gets shot. And I knew it would work because it has a nice little mini 3-act structure. There's a lot of character interaction in the beginning, so I could have fun with dialogue. And then there's a lot of action the last half. So I knew it would be really fun to animate. And on top of it, when I first drew these pages in the year 2000, I was imagining them animated. I wanted to see this thing come to life. So I took the 20 pages of comic and brought it into Premiere and timed everything out, kind of like using a stopwatch. I'd hit the play button, imagine the scene, how long would it take. A technique I learned from Miyazaki while watching a documentary on Studio Ghibli. And roughly timed it out, and it turned out that 20 pages of my comic turns into about 10 minutes of screen time. And I literally used the comic as storyboards and animatic, and we'll get into the details of that in a minute. But before I could even start working on doing layouts, I had a couple things I had to solve. While I'd gone and streamlined my character making process for the commercial projects I had worked on, I knew that first I needed to update the main character's model and rig, and that took me a couple of weeks, and then I had to update some of the other main characters, and that was taking too long. Although they're nice, fully featured rigs, I knew that I had at least 5 gang members, a couple of supporting cast members, and a bunch of bystanders that I wanted to have like in the background, so I needed to be able to create characters very, very quickly. So I came upon this idea of doing universal rigs, which was essentially just adapting the Genesis 8 platform into Blender, but then modifying it so it looks like my art style, which is what I was doing already with each of the characters, but the idea was to create one rig that could turn into lots of characters really quickly. So I baked in a lot of the morphs from the Genesis 8 that could change the face shape, change the body type. I figured out how to do like a proportional slider so you could change the proportions so it would change the head and body size separately. And then all their expressions and everything were baked in with a custom rig so I could quickly have them emote and talk if they needed to. And by doing so, I ended up creating these are some of the examples of the characters I created using this system, and each of these characters I could create in a couple of days instead of having to spend weeks and weeks and weeks trying to create new ones from scratch. And then I would use purchased assets like clothes or hair or whatnot from the Daz store that worked with the model, and then just modify them to fit my cartoon style. And so that saved me tons and tons and tons of time, although there was a little bit of back-end fiddling that had to happen to like attach the clothes to the model, so like all the drivers worked and everything. And so I had an assistant to help me with that. And then later, I got some help at last year's Blender conference. I met I have a guy named Addy Sage who offered to help me create a Python script that would do some of that for me. And he did it. Thank you, Addy. You're awesome. So the other thing I had to figure out was that this short was going to require a lot of cityscapes, so a lot of detailed sets. The comic is kind of known for all of its accurate backgrounds and all these rendered shots of Chicago, and the Chinatown sequence is no different. So I wanted to make sure that the backgrounds were going to reflect the actual neighborhood in Chicago. And so I came upon a solution. Instead of trying to model every single building, what I did was custom model a couple of the landmark buildings, like this temple building, which is definitely like the biggest landmark in the neighborhood. And then this very iconic old restaurant that has this like crazy sign. There's some of the things, if you were to go to the actual neighborhood in Chicago, you would recognize these buildings immediately. But for the other buildings, they're a little bit more nondescript. The signs I could replicate by looking at photos. And so I could pick some of the iconic signs and do those. And then the rest of the buildings I could build using some like more generic as a way to fill them in without needing to look absolutely accurate. So I came upon a solution of using procedural buildings. And I'd used this in Restless Sleep to create this nighttime skyline by finding a wonderful tutorial online by an artist named Hammerbuilt, who has a procedural buildings tutorial that uses geometry nodes and just a couple of simple modular collections to create all sorts of buildings. So I used it to create these distant buildings. And then I used that to create a matte painting that I could just plop in the background. But then for all these foreground buildings, I adapted that by making some new models that I could just swap the collections in and out of, in part by reusing some sets that I had purchased. And so I didn't have to like custom model everything from scratch, and then I could create dozens and dozens and dozens of buildings that then would appear in the backgrounds. So once I had that, I had my characters, I had my sets, I was ready to start doing layouts. And so adapting comics to film, I've always kind of thought of comics and film as being analogous mediums. They're both visual storytelling, but one uses space and the other uses time. With comics, you kind of have to turn time into space. You have to turn it into space on the page. And so I think of panels like this, like a longer, bigger panel like this is literally taking more time. It's like a camera pan or a zoom or a dolly shot. And so for this shot, this is how I first imagined it just being a pan up as the characters chased into the background. But this is how the final shot got adapted. And so you can see I added a zoom to focus in on the bad guy first, and then it pulls back, and then we have that pan. But the idea held. But then I think of these smaller panels on the pages as being more fast moments. So in adapting it, so I have more of a short shot where they're chasing, and then another quick shot where the baddie turns around to fire, and then another short shot that then freeze frames. And I even imagined that while I was drawing this was the idea of like, ooh, even just by getting rid of all the shading, sort of implies something different happening. And then we finish this sequence with a longer shot where we have some dialogue. So this is how this all translated into animation.
you're going down now, pal.
So the layout process for me, again, it's very much like doing comics. As a comic creator, I already think like a director. I'm already imagining what is the set, where's the camera going to be, what's the blocking of the characters, and then I'm thinking in terms of pacing. And so going into layout is very much already plugging into how I think. I'm just using a different set of tools in a different medium, whereas instead of drawing everything in 2 dimensions, imagining where the camera is and then turning that into a 2D composition, I'm imagining that same thing, except now I literally have a 3D camera I can move around, and I literally have 3D characters that I can pose. They're more like puppets. It's very different to pose a character in 3D than it is to draw it. But I can quickly make that mental jump, and I'm sort of always jumping back and forth between thinking in 3D and thinking in 2D. How does that 3-dimensional shape turn into a 2-dimensional image in the camera view? And so I would, to speed things along, I pulled up the animatic, I pulled it into the video sequencer, pulled up a preview window, and then I could just map shot by shot by shot to shot. And create my layout files, which then later get turned into shot files to be animated. So another thing I had to do was to adapt my art style. And I clearly wanted to do cel-shaded characters with more painted-looking backgrounds. Doing cel-shaded characters is pretty known territory in Blender. You can use cel shading materials. My own innovations are to be able to change the lighting and shadow colors through the character rig, and then I added a rim system. But I borrowed very much from the tutorials that Lightning Boy posted. So that was known, and then just using Grease Pencil with a line art modifier to do outlines, pretty straightforward. The painted backgrounds are a little more involved, though. I'm just using a basic EEVEE render, but I'm focusing on pushing the colors to make it look more illustrational and less photoreal, and again, using Grease Pencil to do line art, and then I'm using mist depth layers and rendering out separate sort of painted look with the Kurohara node from the compositor. And then I have to reassemble all this stuff in compositing. But then the final thing that kind of pushes it into paint is that I have an actual painted textures that I painted in gouache and scanned in, and I can layer those in planes based on the depth layer, or even camera tracked by putting them on literal planes in Blender and rendering it out as another pass, and then that gets composited over the top to give it some brush strokes. And so that pushes the backgrounds into kind of a softer look, and so that separates them out. And then I also like adding effects like speed lines, which again, just blurred background, paint texture, and simple particle system to handle the lines. So as you can see, I've had a lot of fun making all this. And so I want to just leave you with a little preview of Paradigm Shift Chinatown. This was the first scene that I completed, start to finish, including cleanup. This is sort of the first version of the sound from my sound designer, and the final dialogue from our voice cast. So enjoy this little kung fu fight.
Assaulting an officer. That'll get you 5 to 10. Okay, cough up. Easy.
Mike, watch out! You shits better give it up!
Yeah! Anybody else?
In case you geniuses haven't figured it out already, you're all under arrest.
The fuck?
Freeze! Police! I said freeze!
So there you go. So thanks, everybody, for coming. I've gone a little over time, so if you have any questions, I'll just be standing over here. Feel free to approach me afterwards. And I'd love to talk to you about collaboration and for future projects. I know that I'm just one guy. I'm learning all this stuff, character animation, modeling, all this stuff. There's so many people in this very room who I know are way better at all of this stuff than I am. And I would love to pick your brain, and I'd love to work with you. So if you're interested, please come and talk with me.